Hello, everyone. I'm Therese Bottomly, editor of The Oregonian and Oregon Live. This is Beat Check with The Oregonian. Today, I'm talking with Fedor Zarkhin, the reporter who just published a 4-part series on the killings in 1974 and 1975 of 4 Black Portlanders by police. You can find the stories, called The Forgotten Four, at projects.oregonlive.com/the-forgotten-4. Fedor, welcome back to Beat Check.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for readers who haven't yet finished the series, let's give them an overview of what happened in Portland starting in 1974 and spilling into the next year.
So in 1974 and 75, Portland police killed 4 Black Portlanders, 3 men in 74 and a 17-year-old in 75. So this is in the space of about 5 months, and this is really unprecedented string of police killings before then and since then. And after the 4th killing of a teenager in this kind of botched sting operation, there were protests, there was demands for an inquest from the district attorney, there was a federal investigation. So it was kind of, and it was the first time there was such a broad coalition of groups coming together to protest police violence.
So you started this reporting as part of the Oregonian Oregon Live's look inward after the murder of George Floyd. In that case, reporter Rob Davis and photographer Beth Nakamura produced the project Publishing Prejudice, which looked really deeply at the Oregonians' historic racism and our failures in the past. And I know that was part of the concept originally for this, was these episodes really weren't covered extensively and in depth the way they might have been today. So tell me about the original concept, which I guess was going to be a podcast.
So the original concept, like you said, we were doing this broad examination post 2020 social justice movement. We were sort of trying to figure out, okay, what's our role in all of this? Like we, of course, as journalists, as newspapers historically try to see ourselves as external to all things as much as possible, to the point of like some organizations, not testifying on bills that affect the newspaper industry, and so forth. But after 2020, we're like, okay, let's also like consider what the story here is. And then of course we saw, through Rob Davis's reporting, and had our suspicions confirmed that we're not just these impartial actors. We're definitely a part of a larger system, a larger narrative, a larger story. So, and after that kind of awareness, we wanted to see if we could do something to compensate isn't the right word, but just to rebalance, to do what we could a little bit to rebalance the scales, to rebalance the scale just a little bit to the extent possible. So the original idea of a podcast was to examine in every episode various aspects of Oregon's history that reflect its original idea as like a place comfortable for white Americans. For example, looking at exclusion laws, looking at the gradual segregation to smaller and smaller areas of Native Americans, and so forth. So it was going to be, to an extent, like a historic podcast, and the name, if I may say, State of Exclusion, of this theoretical podcast that has not come to be, but the name is great, and for that reason should probably be turned into a podcast, maybe.
Yeah, it's interesting as we're on a podcast right now, and it's a different medium for sure. And some stories are best told as a conversation like we're having right now, and some stories perhaps are better told in the form that you and Beth Nakamura and Mark Graves, with design by Mark Friesen, were able to tell, on Oregon Live. So as a reporter, it was pretty clear that an obvious organizing principle was around the 4 people, 3 young men and a teenager, as you said, who were shot and killed. And I can only imagine that after so much time had passed, family members might wonder, what are you doing here on their doorstep? And what is your agenda? And is there any trust there in terms of sharing really deep and, emotional things? So tell us about how the reporting challenges went for you as a reporter and how you found those family members and friends who were willing to revisit that traumatic time.
So that was definitely a mixed experience. And I absolutely went into it with this sense of like, I need to communicate to people that I think it is important, this is important, and why I think it is important. And to communicate the fact that like we're really putting some resources into this. We're not just trying to get something out, like basically to communicate like we mean it and I mean it, And in most cases, it didn't really take that much convincing, because to the people I ended up writing about, like, they don't need convincing. They don't need to be told that this is important. Like, for them, they know it's important. It doesn't matter how long it's been. It's just a question of them believing or trusting that I am also aware of the significance. For everybody I talk to, including relatives, including like descendants, including like family members who never met the people who died. It was universally an emotional subject. So, yeah, there were some challenges, of course, where, for example, one person I talked to, it was very difficult to reach him. First trying to talk to his daughter, who said, oh, he's busy and so forth. And finally reached him and essentially listened to a lecture about how, the Oregonian and other newspapers, we're always just trying to make ourselves look good by writing about the plight of Black folk, and that this is probably just another example of that, and he doesn't want to be a part of that, and nothing ever changes. This kind of, 2020 is not new. The George Floyd protests were not a new thing, and every time after a protest, there's like an interest, and then it fades away, and then ultimately nothing really happens. And to this man, his brother's life was worth so much more than that. So, that was a little hurtful, of course. What can you do? But then, I talked to other people in the family who were like, oh no, please, like, we really want people to know about what happened. We really, really do. This is a big deal. We want his photograph out there. We want people to know. Another person I talked to, she at some point after on our fourth or fifth conversation mentioned that, she'd always felt like she'd been sort of almost like waiting, wondering when someone's going to come and ask her to tell more, because it was obvious that there was so much more to the story than was known. Other folks, it's like they just, definitely saw it as an opportunity. For example, like Ricky Johnson's brother, Michael Johnson, was just saying like, he wants people to know his brother's name. He wants he wants his brother's name to be chanted and repeated during protests. So, I think it was clear to people like, okay, so if we want people to know these stories, this looks like an opportunity to do that. And, of course, just, as one does when reporting, you kind of approach it with some genuineness, or like all genuineness. Of course, what I really had on my side was some time and kind of a directive to like go forth and discover, go forth and learn. So I was able to actually sit down with Tonda, sit down with Michael for, like several hours, and keep coming back to them and really be present in a way with these folks in the way that it was critical to be,
Yeah, very authentic and not in a hurry, willing to sit and really take the time to stay in the conversation.
Yeah, because trust, like I won't like it's definitely true that the building a trust relationship was I never felt like, oh, okay, I've gained trust and now we're good. It's like I did feel like I was constantly, and I was also told that like everything I was doing and said was being watched. And people were like, oh, different families I talked to, they talked to each other. People I didn't even know knew each other. The one of them's telling me, yeah, well, I checked in with so and so, and she said we can trust you, so fine. We'll talk to you. So it was just like there's it wasn't just like you waltz in and start taking notes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, as a longtime Portlander, I was struck. It was a bit of a walk down memory lane with, the names, Kent Ford and Daryl Milner and Ron Herndon and Rutherford and Shamsuddin. I mean, it really took me back. And, there's a reason for some of that distrust, which we explored in Publishing Prejudice. We were very much a newspaper by and for white men for a long time and did not pay attention to issues in the Black community. And so when you were looking at the Oregonians' coverage of 1974 and 75 through a lens of today, like how did it rate? We know we missed stories. We know we told them mainly or solely from a sort of white male power broker standpoint. What did you find in looking at the archives and talking to people who lived through the killings in 1974 and 75 in Portland?
So I don't know to what extent I'm qualified to make like a big historical assessment of how we did, right? That's a subject for like someone's PhD at some point, not mine. But I would say that I think like soon after what we wrote about here, soon after these events, there was more of an awareness like, oh, okay, there is this big theme of our time and of our place that is like police relations with Black Portlanders and like the power structures in Black Portland. Like in my sense, and there very well might be people from that time who would disagree with me, that starting in like the late 70s, early 80s, again, so just several years after this, it became less of this is something we write about sometimes, to like, okay, this is a major issue of our time. This is not a peripheral thing. This is something that is like foundational and something that we will visit and revisit time and again. In 74 and 75 specifically, I feel like, of course, from my perspective, we could have done a lot more in terms of like looking deeper at these 4 killings. I personally, I imagine that one of the reasons potentially that we didn't is because, in all 4 cases, the people, they had guns, in 2 of them, the men fired their guns, so I can imagine there being a part of, in the reporters and editors' minds as they're, figuring out, okay, we've got like a million stories to do. What are we really going to dig into? That they might have said, well, let's move on because here there's, the guy had a gun. That, of course, misses the bigger point that this is like, that this is part of a much bigger story for Black Portland, where just the mere act of like looking into what exactly happened, even if the person had a gun, just asking those questions, trying to talk to families would be meaningful. So for example, like with this series, we spell out exactly what happened. There's no hiding that like there were guns involved, and so forth. There's no hiding that like Ricky Johnson was trying to rob somebody with a gun that was unloaded, but still, if you have a gun pointed at you, you don't give a damn whether it's loaded or not in that moment because you don't know, right? So like nobody's hiding behind that, but that's not the point. The point isn't like who's at fault, who's not at fault. The point is like cumulatively together, this is part of like this city's history and thousands of people's attitudes towards the establishment, essentially, not just to the Oregonian, not just to the police bureau, but just to like the majority of society is influenced if not shaped by these kinds of traumatic and tragic events. So I think what I'm trying to communicate, I think, in these stories is not a he's right, she's wrong, or she's right. That's not the point here. The point is, like, these are all, from my perspective, these are all just tragedies. Each one of these cases is just sad. It's just sad, for everyone involved. And that, to me, is like the thing that can unite, that does cross the racial misunderstandings. We can all understand, like, that it's sad. I think
somebody lost a son, somebody lost a brother. Yeah. I did hear from a few readers who were saying, well, why are you writing these stories? There were guns involved, and you were not setting out as an investigative reporter to examine whether the shootings were justified, but your approach was more explanatory. It's like there is a reason that members of the community look at police interactions that end up being fatal. There is a lens through which they look at those interactions today that is rooted in, for many people, in this particular time. And there were changes, for the first time in inquest, which was an attempt, I think, by the establishment to be more transparent. So, I presume it might have been a little tricky to talk to family members about the issues of, what exactly happened and the fact that guns were involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, but I think part of what I set out to do, of course, is to figure out, so can we find out a little bit more about what happened? And I think a lot of the families were operating in a vacuum. The people alive today were, say, siblings, and their parents just didn't tell them much about what happened. B, nobody I talked to either requested or was able to obtain records from the police bureau that detailed, the available material, indicating, like, just what happened and what people said and what witnesses said and what the officers said, and so forth. So, but and so having being able to give people more information helped fill that vacuum. Like, that was kind of a parallel track in the reporting. Like, as soon as I got some records or I got information, it'd be stuff I would give to the families because I had people asking me questions about what their own siblings told me. Because for some people, when this happened almost 50 years ago, there was kind of like a shutdown effect. Like, okay, there was this burst of grief of where everybody's talking about it, and then people just shut down, and it doesn't become something that, like, people talk about very much. And that's also a cultural like it's a generational thing. I think now there's a lot more
where families might not talk about painful things. Yeah. So your skills as a reporter, you were able to get to original documents, so I know you looked at our archives, but what other sources did you rely on for documentation?
So the key, of course, were the Portland Police Bureau files that had transcripts of interviews with witnesses, with descriptions of conversations, descriptions of the scene. One case where there were, like, many officers involved, I had transcript with every single one of them. Also, crime scene photos that the Bureau provided. First in Ricky Johnson's case, that was pretty important to kind of be able to see how far the gun landed from his body. First they provided a redacted photo from the crime scene where you see the gun the unloaded gun on the carpet in the living room, and then in the distance, clearly in the kitchen, there's just a black rectangle. So was able to get that without the black rectangle, and you can see Ricky's body kind of pointing in the away from the gun towards the kitchen door, and like clearly far away from the gun. So that was I think, like powerful visual evidence that kind of spoke better than, anything that we could pull from the written records. Also, a large part of the story, parts 3 and 4, are actually about the life and fate of Kenneth Sanford, who's the officer who killed Ricky Johnson. And the reason is that, his story is fascinating. I think we often are looking at things either from like the victim perspective or the cop perspective, but here, you have a guy whose life was really turned upside down by this killing, and again, by citing some public records laws, we were able to get the several psychological evaluations performed, one in 1978 and one in 2005, of Kenneth Sanford, that basically spelled out like how he wasn't doing that well. And this ended up being like critical because his family did not want to talk to me at all. His friends did. They did allude
to show the long-lasting psychological effects on him as well as on the family of the victim. I'm sure it was tricky too to reach out to those police sources from, decades ago. And what was that like, getting former police officers, retired police officers, to talk to you?
I think what I found, what was enjoyable about it was just like with the families, like none of this stuff is ancient history. This is when these people, they were in their 20s and 30s. This was like the kind of like their most impressionable years, and here they are involved in life and death matters. That's a lot for a person, I imagine. And some people, wanted nothing to do with it. Others just kind of tentative, tell me, hey, other people aren't probably going to want to talk to you because generally speaking, we don't trust the media. But, people definitely opened up. They wanted their story out there, or they wanted me to get it right. And also, honestly, a lot of time, these guys, they just wanted to, it was clear that this was overall, like their police career in the 70s and 80s was like a meaningful time for them. It really shaped who they are. And, now they're in their late 70s. One of them, every single time I called, I remember I called like at 8 a.m. There's the TVs in the background. He's like, hey, sorry, let me turn it off. So, I have no idea what his life was about, but it was just struck me that like, no matter when I called, and I think he, among other people, just enjoyed talking about that time. The trickiest part, of course, was conversations about people. A lot of officers, a lot of former former policemen. There's a lot of hemming and hawing and when talking about like the actual impact and how the protest and the inquest and so forth changed how they did their jobs. There's a lot of like trying to say without saying very directly that like, okay, yeah, we kind of had to do things differently. So
yeah, the years since these killings, there were some really tough times between the Portland Police Bureau and members of the Black community. And then, you get to the George Floyd era of massive protests. Did anything about this reporting kind of make you see those very, very large and sustained protests in Portland, which is a predominantly white city? Did it kind of give you a different perspective on those protests?
I think, one of the pieces of feedback I've heard, or maybe not, one of the things I've heard frequently from people who read the series who were not sources is essentially that, oh, wow, yeah, this reminds me, this has been going on forever. This really has been going on for a long time, that what we had in 2020 wasn't, it was new, but it wasn't that new, and the issues that were being protested weren't that incredibly new. So that was a whole process of discovery. And, I think probably strangely enough, one of the most like mind-blowing reporting moments throughout this came when I really started to dig into the Kerner Commission report, which, so reading some passages of it, it's like you start like, there's like tears almost like welling up, because just the language is so stridently righteous in a good, not self-righteous, but like stridently like, no, for real, this is a problem. Like for real, there is discrimination, and we for real need to do something about this. And if I have a moment, I'd love to read from.
Yeah, sure. I know what you mean. It's like there was an opportunity. It was literally laid out by the Kerner Commission, and yet here we are with some of the same issues today. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so just as a pause, I'm gonna, some of the language is outdated.
Yeah.
So, in speaking of the Negro, we do not speak of them, we speak of us. For the freedoms and opportunities of all Americans are diminished and imperiled when they are denied to some Americans. The tragic waste of human spirit and resources, the unrecoverable loss to the nation which this denial has already caused and continues to produce, no longer can be ignored or afforded. Two premises underlie the work of the Commission: that this nation cannot abide violence and disorder if it is to ensure the safety of its people and their progress in a free society. That's one. Two, that this nation will deserve neither safety nor progress unless it can demonstrate the wisdom and the will to undertake decisive action against the root causes of racial disorder. This report is addressed to the institutions of government and to the conscience of the nation, but even more urgently to the mind and heart of each citizen. The responsibility for decisive action, never more clearly demanded in the history of our country, rests on all of us. This was 1968. This was after, protests and riots across the country in 1967, and there's just it's
very aspirational language, very clear directive about decisive action, and yet not as much done perhaps as the writers of that report had dreamed. So thank you, Fedor, for the terrific series, The Forgotten Four. It was our look back at a seminal moment in 1974 and 75 for Portland. And with that, I'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Tell a friend and help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.